Welcome back. Happy Tuesday. Today we are going to get started with rounding. Thank you for those that logged in yesterday and did your multiplication and your division, and for those of you that did your work in the packet. We really appreciate that, so keep up the hard work. This anchor chart might look very familiar to a lot of you because this is the same anchor chart that we used earlier in the year. So I'm just going to do a brief little overview of the chant that we sing when we go through it, and then the 4 steps. We'll go over rounding to the tens place, and we're going to go over rounding to the hundreds place, and then you'll have the opportunity to try on either Edge Elastic or on the paper-based packet. There's only a total of 24 problems for today, so 12 for rounding to the tens place and 12 for rounding to the hundreds place. So we can get started. So our first step is that we need to find the place. So it's really important when you're reading the directions that you're reading if you need to round to the tens place or the hundreds place, because it will change where you box the number. So for the next step, you need to look at your neighbor next door. So if I box my 2, because I'm rounding to the tens place, so I box the number that's in the tens place. I draw an arrow to my neighbor next door, which is 3. Third step, if your neighbor is 5 or bigger, you add 1 more. If it's 4 or less, you let it rest and you write stay. So when we're looking at the number 23, you box a 2 because that's in the tens place. The 3 is in the ones place. That's your neighbor next door. My neighbor next door is 4 or less, so I let it rest and I write the word stay. So when you write the word stay, that means the number in the box stays, so you bring that down. Whatever number is not boxed, you add a 0 for. So here there's only one number that's not boxed, so I'm only going to add 1 0. So then the number 23 rounds to 20 in the tens place. So if we're looking at the number 28, I'm still rounding to the tens place because that's what my instructions say. So I box the number 2 because that's the tens place. I draw an arrow to my neighbor next door. If my neighbor is 5 or bigger, I add 1 more, or if it's 4 or less, I let it rest. But because 8 is 5 or bigger, I'm going to plus 1. So what you do with this plus 1 is you add it to the number that's boxed. So 2 plus 1 is 3, so I put a 3, and then I have one number that's not boxed, so I put a 0 for it. So moving right along, I know some of you might have questions if we're rounding to the tens place, but there is no number in the tens place. So when that happens, we have to add a placeholder. So if you want to on your paper or on your notes today when you're going through your assignment, feel free to box the missing number in the tens place, which is really 0 because that's your placeholder. So you could even write a 0 there if you wanted to. And then you draw an arrow to your neighbor next door. Again, my neighbor next door is 5 or bigger, so I add 1 more. 0 plus 1 is 1, so I put that there. And then there's one number not boxed, so I add 1 0 to represent that number. So the number 5 in the tens place rounds to 10. It rounds up. Moving on, the number 2. Again, there is no number in the tens place, so I'm going to add a 0 for my placeholder. I'm going to draw an arrow to my neighbor next door. My neighbor next door is 4 or less, so I let it rest. I'm going to write the word stay. So when I put the word stay, that means I'm just going to bring the 0 down, and then because this number is one number, I'm going to add a 0. If I add a 0, the number just becomes 0, 0, so you could just leave it at 1, 0. So 2 rounds to 0 in the tens place. Now, some of you might be having questions or concerns about when you have a 3-digit number but you need to round to the tens place. You might automatically assume that you're rounding to the hundreds, but that is not correct because the directions tell me to round to the tens place. So when this happens and you have other numbers here, you always box whatever number is to the left of the number in the tens place. So I went to go box the number 3 and realized there was a 1 next to it. So now this number becomes 13 and I box the entire number. I still draw an arrow to my neighbor next door. My neighbor next door is a 6, so that's 5 or bigger, so I need to add one more. So when I add one more, 13 plus 1 is 14, and then there's still one number that is not boxed, so I add 1 0 as its placeholder. So 136 rounds to 140 in the tens place. So that is for rounding to the tens place. We are now going to move on and round to the hundreds place. Oops, you still need to see the steps, sorry. So the steps still apply and you do the same 4 steps, but this time, instead of boxing the number in the tens place, we are boxing the number in the hundreds place because our directions ask us to round to the hundreds place. So the number 134, the number 1 is in the hundreds place, so you box that. You draw an arrow to your neighbor right next door, so not to 3 and 4, but just to 3. So when I do that, 3 is 4 or less, so I let it rest. When I let it rest, I write the word stay. So the number 1 stays and I bring that down. There are 2 numbers now that are not boxed, so I bring 2 zeros down as that placeholder. So now the number becomes 100, so 134 rounds to 100 in the nearest hundreds place. So 187. Again, you box the number in the in the hundreds place, and you draw an arrow to your neighbor next door, which is 8. 8 is 5 or bigger, so I add one more. So 1 plus 1 is 2. There are 2 numbers not boxed, so I add 2 zeros to represent these 2 numbers. So 187 rounds to 200 in the hundreds place. So just like we had to do for the tens place, when we did not have numbers in the tens place, you're going to add a 0 as your placeholder. So I need a round to the hundreds place, but I don't have a number there. So I add a 0, and I box that. I draw an arrow right next door to my friend, the 2. 2 is 4 or less, so I let it rest, and I put the word stay. So I bring down the 0, and then again, there's 2 numbers that are not boxed, so if you wanted to, you could add 0, 0, but that whole thing just stays at 0. And then, moving on to number 75, again, there is no number in the hundreds place, so you add a 0 as your placeholder. You draw an arrow to your neighbor next door. My neighbor next door is 5 or bigger, so I'm going to add one more. So 0 plus 1 is 1, and then I have 2 numbers not boxed, so I add 2 zeros as that placeholder. So the number 75, when rounding to the nearest 100, rounds to 100. And then the last one, which is kind of a bonus one for today, is the number 1,582. I still want to round it to the hundreds place, even though it's showing a number in the thousands place. So I go to find the number in the hundreds place. It does have a number to the left of it, so I box the entire thing. So now this number becomes 15 here. Draw my arrow to my neighbor right next door. 8 is 5 or bigger, so I add one more, so I put plus 1. So 15 plus 1 is 16. I have 2 numbers that are not boxed, so I'm going to add 2 zeros to represent that placeholder. So this was your rounding lesson for today. Feel free to use this and take notes while you're answering your questions. Today's assignment is on Edulastic. It is called Tuesday 3 at 24. rounding practice. So go ahead and take that or do it on the paper base. And if you have any other questions, please let me know. Have a wonderful day.